Not a problem at all. Um, I so appreciate the chance to chat with you. Just to give you just a brief background of me and my role now and where I came from before we dive in to all of Disney's work from an avian perspective. As you heard before, I'm a conservation manager with Disney Conservation and Disney's Animal Science and Environment. My team supports our conservation efforts at and around our properties around the world. And so, that starts with thinking about how we best increase biodiversity on our properties, how we engage the staff of Disney as well as communities and organizations adjacent to where we work to really scale up and achieve much bigger regional scale change, not just trying to influence the properties where we work. So that mandate is across wildlife, but I'm a bird guy at heart. So I'm field ornithologist by background and training, and I've been 8 years with the company. Somebody mentioned Arizona. That's where I grew up. So all things birds in Arizona are near and dear to my heart. That said, let's dive in a little bit to kind of the big picture of Disney and conservation, and then we'll take it to the birds, and we'll talk that the rest of the time. Please keep any and all questions coming. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. And so if you see me kind of looking over and eyeballing the screen next to me, it's because I'm just making sure that there aren't any questions. It'll be a lot more fun if it's more interactive, if you're asking questions of me and I'm asking and answering those questions along the way. It'll be a lot more fun than just having to listen to me chat at you for the next 45 minutes. So any and all questions, bring them on. All right. Well, that said, let's get going. So when people think about Walt Disney, conservation is not the first word that comes to mind. But a quote that he once said was, you probably heard people talk about conservation. Well, conservation isn't just the business of a few people, it's a matter that concerns all of us. And if you look at the scope and the span of his work, he was at the forefront of trying to connect entertainment with nature. He really popularized the nature documentary at that point, he leveraged humanizing animals as a way to get people interested and excited about animals. Because at that time, conservation was mostly living in the hunting community. And he really brought nature into people's rooms through the work that he does. And we at the company try to continue that through both our nature documentaries, but also through spaces like the Seas with Nemo and Friends, Disney's Animal Kingdom, where I work now. And then Disney Conservation specifically, we really try and continue that legacy that Walt started with the focus on protecting the magic of nature together. That's our tagline, and that together piece I think is the most important component, because Disney, as big of a company as it is, what we do is still just a drop in the bucket. It takes people coming together to really make meaningful large scale change. And so the way we try to do that is we have targeted programs to try and save particular species of wildlife, but we couple that with activities and efforts to try and engage with communities where we're trying to do that work, so that collectively we're able to protect the planet in much bigger ways than any particular group of us could do by ourselves. So we'll talk through a couple different examples of what that looks like. And first up, we're going to start on the opposite side of the world, talking about Siberian crane conservation. I emphasize that together piece. And one way that Disney conservation works is by working hand in hand with conservation organizations that do incredible, great work around the world. So our partner on the Siberian crane work is the International Crane Foundation. So for those of you that may not know much about Siberian cranes, this species is the most aquatic of the 14 crane species that we have around the world. This picture really kind of encapsulates the ins and outs of their biology. Almost all of their foraging is done in wetlands at a very specific depth, from just above their feet to up to their hocks, where you see them standing now, because everything they eat are aquatic tubers that they pull out of the mud. They pair for life, as you see right here, male and a female, and they only successfully raise one colt a year, one young crane a year. And that crane is incredibly dependent on mom and dad for a very long period of time, all the way from the breeding grounds all the way to the wintering grounds. And it's really not until the following northern migration begins that crane becomes independent. Now, all of those different combinations add up to a species that is at risk from human activities and human development. And unfortunately, we used to have three different independent populations of cranes. One that wintered in China, one that wintered in India, and one that wintered in Iran. And unfortunately, in that entire western half of their range, there is only one individual bird left alive. And so all Siberian crane conservation now is completely dependent on the single remaining population. And so we're going to take a little journey, a little migratory journey through the different life stages of this bird, and we'll talk about the ins and outs of what that bird faces along the way. So we'll start on the breeding grounds. This species is named the Siberian crane because it breeds in the far, far northeastern portion of Siberia. And it requires these vast open tracts of land in which to breed. You'll see that there is one crane in this picture and its mate is somewhere nearby, but they nest at incredibly low densities. The upshot of that is that there's very little human pressure up here right now. At least direct human pressure. Things like climate change are still an ongoing challenge. But what that means is we've been able to partner with folks in Russia, and through the International Crane Foundation, the lands that this species depends on for breeding, over 70% of it is now in protection at the federal level, which is incredibly exciting. The breeding grounds are in good shape for this species. But as cranes travel south, by the time they get to northeastern China, they are now in lands that have been cultivated and developed for literally thousands of years. It's one of the most developed landscapes on the planet. And these cranes prefer wide open spaces, which are just perfect for agriculture. So basically, the only places that they are now, or the strongholds for them on this migratory journey south, are wetlands that are protected as national nature reserves by the Chinese government. And immediately adjacent to all of these wetlands is development, towns, agriculture. And so the trick is trying to manage these wetlands in a way that support cranes while also being able to utilize those waters to support the surrounding industries, agriculturally, industrially, and from an urban perspective. Because just protecting habitats for cranes is going to set up conflict with the locals. And so it's really about coexisting and utilizing these resources together. If we continue that migratory journey farther down, the reason I mentioned that the way Disney conservation works is we look to partner with organizations and focus on species that are in the regions around the properties where we work. Shanghai Disney Resort is nearby to the one and only place that Siberian cranes spend the winter. All Siberian cranes depend on Poyang Lake as their wintering habitat. Basically, the rest of the surrounding landscape has all been developed to one extent or another. And because of that, cranes now depend on this particular lake as the one spot where they go to the wintering grounds. Now, that doesn't mean that there's still not human activity on Poyang Lake. Still lots of agriculture around it, a very heavy aquaculture industry, whether that's crabbing, whether that's fishing, or even ecotourism. But because there's such an integrated effort to support cranes and to support human industry at the same time, there's been a great deal of success in managing to weave or thread that needle between human needs and crane needs. And a lot of what Disney has done, in addition to financial support for this project, has been helping the International Crane Foundation informing those ways that cranes can thrive, especially from an ecotourism perspective at Poyang Lake, while still making sure that the industry, the economy of that area is thriving as well. Eric asked if the ongoing war is hampering recovery efforts. For so many species, the answer to that question is yes. Specifically for cranes, because their habitat is so far north, and because we were able, through the Russian government, to secure protection for those habitats before the war started, Siberian cranes, at least, are still in really good shape in Russia. All of those protections were independent of connections between Russia and the US. And so they have continued strong despite all of the political unrest that's been happening in Russia over the recent years. So this has been a real success story for both the International Crane Foundation and for Disney. When we started this project, there were only about 3,600 Siberian cranes left. But in the last 10 years that this project has been going on, that number has climbed to over 5,500 cranes. So that scale of population change over that time scale is incredibly exciting. That doesn't mean that we are out of the woods yet. Poyang Lake in recent years has experienced some of the most dramatic flooding and droughts in recorded history. Well, I shouldn't say that. At least in the last 70 years. In the period of time where we have really high quality data, it's been the most extreme weather events that they've had. And so as a result of that, cranes have actually moved out of their traditional aquatic habitats and are now foraging in agricultural areas because there just isn't the food to support them in those lakes. And so that's led to a whole new realm of work to both try and restore the wetland plants that these species depend on in Poyang Lake, but also working with local communities to make sure that farmers are supportive and not antagonized by cranes foraging in their fields. Mary asked how many cranes are in this remaining population. So we're up to 5,500 now, which is incredibly exciting. So certainly not out of the woods yet or out of the wetlands, as the case may be for this species, but things are trending in a really good way. So let's keep the story here in China a little bit longer and shift over to the Shanghai Disney Resort that I mentioned earlier. Now, when Shanghai Disney Resort was that land was first purchased, well, let me take a quick step back and say, the Shanghai region is one of the largest and most extensively developed metropolitan areas in the world. It's the biggest metropolitan area in China. And so the idea of trying to create a habitat restoration project within that context, a lot of people said that when we started developing the Shanghai Disney Resort, that anything done for nature would be a great place for people to go and relax, but we really wouldn't be able to see many benefits from a wildlife perspective. What we're looking at right now is Wishing Star Park. So south of the kind of Magic Kingdom or Disneyland style resort is this lake that was basically created as an urban wetland restoration project. When the land was purchased, it was all agriculture and industrial complex. And so this lake system that you see is a human-made lake, and then the borders around it were restored. Now, I say restored loosely because there's a lot of variation in the types of habitats around the park. Some of them are much more manicured, like the picture you see in the middle. Other areas, like on the right, are walkways out over restored wetlands, and you see these aquatic forest trees growing up out of those wetlands. And they are meant to be areas where people can closely come in contact, interact with nature as these pathways wind through these wetlands. And then some areas on the picture on the left, you see an island that quite literally was created, vegetated, and then left alone for plant succession to happen naturally. And there's a wide range of different management styles, all the way from highly manicured to big chunks of Wishing Star Park is only cut back to reset plant succession once a year outside of the breeding season. And what's resulted is 124 species at last count being detected at this urban wetland park. And it's been fun watching those colonization patterns happen. And not just the colonization patterns, but the patterns of abundance of species continue to grow post-establishment. There's a monthly monitoring bird program that was set up at the time that the property was being built, and it's continued for the 8 years since to this day. And so we've been able to document the changes in population and establishment and successful growth of those populations of species like this China endemic, the light-vented bulbul, also called the Chinese bulbul, or the Chinese spotted duck. Now, the value to wildlife is critical because there's so few remaining green spaces in the Shanghai region. But also, this is part of the East Asian Australasian migratory flyway. That's a mouthful. And so having locations along that migratory pathway where species can stop over, rest, and then continue the migratory journey is absolutely critical. A lot of those species that we've seen are migratory species that stop over or that overwinter at Wishing Star Park before they return to their breeding areas. The reason I wanted to close the Shanghai story with this picture, though, is the history of environmental activism, environmental awareness in China is very similar to the US's story, but it's offset by almost 50 years. So they are coming out of their kind of silent spring into kind of the renaissance of the 60s and the 70s that the US experienced, where a rapidly increasing portion of the population was interested, excited, and engaged in environmental activism, environmental awareness, and they're hungry for connections with nature. And again, in the Shanghai region, there are very, very few places where you can go. And because of the way this park was created with corridors of habitat, with pathways winding through those corridors, it's one of the best places to birdwatch in the Shanghai region. Not just from a diversity perspective, but from the perspective of being able to get close and see bird life that has become used to and habituated to people. And so, because of that, there's been this growing number of programs, both from other organizations coming onto Wishing Star Park and Disney bringing guests into Wishing Star Park to be able to experience and connect with nature in a way that the vast majority of these folks have not experienced nature before. All right. Oh, I'm getting behind here on the chat. Oh, nope, never mind. I'm caught up. So switching gears from China, coming all the way to the other side of the world here, I wanted to spend some time chatting about Lighthouse Point in the Bahamas. So in the Bahamas, Disney our relationship with the Bahamas is connected to the cruise line. Now, Disney Cruise Line is doing its best to be one of the most environmentally friendly cruise lines in the world. Now, those of you who knows the cruise industry know that cruising in general is not known as an environmentally friendly industry, and so we're really trying to set a new standard for what that means. So what we're looking right now is the southern tip of the island of Eleuthera. The island's a very long linear island, but the southern tip was purchased by Disney to be built as the second cruise port, the first being a standalone island called Castaway Cay. So this is a little under 1,000 acres, that southern tip of the island. Um, and at the outset of this project, which started 5 years ago, our challenge to ourselves was, what does it look like to try and do a cruise port totally differently than how it's been done in this region before? What does it look like to start with wildlife and conservation in mind from the get-go? And so, of that 1,000 acres, only 15% is going to be developed, and that portion is concentrated on the southeastern shoreline and on the southern shoreline. And part of the reason for that is, as we've done monthly monitoring of this property over the course of the last 5 years. Let me take a quick step back. The image you see is the layout of that monitoring. So the different colors are transects, and the different points are point counts, where we have been able to be looking at a monthly basis at the wildlife community. And so what that's given us is a couple years of data before development actually started, to be able to compare with the data from development itself. And then also, once we go to operation, see how wildlife communities are responding. And so having that baseline data allows us to take targeted actions for particular species, as well as habitat scale management, to try and do the best we can to maintain biodiversity at what it was before. And for some species, be able to actually increase increase the diversity of that species on site, the abundance of those species on site above what they were when we started the project out. And so, going back from a design perspective, because of the monitoring work that we've done, we know that there's very little shorebird nesting on the areas where development is happening. Instead, shorebird nesting is concentrated on these three ponds you see right through the center of the property. And so those are set aside no development is happening on those ponds to safeguard those areas for nesting water birds. And the shoreline areas that are not valuable for nesting for these species, that's where we're focusing people. The vast majority of the land that's not being developed, though, is these upland areas. And these upland areas, the Bahamas still has a fair amount of upland habitat that's not developed, but that's going to change through time. And so we have coupled this community scale monitoring with, we just installed a tracking system across the entirety of the property to be able to follow how different birds and different types of animals move throughout the property. So we can couple community scale monitoring with behavioral and individual scale tracking to be able to explain and understand what is causing the patterns that we're seeing, and then be able to take action to address that. I want to call out this particular species. I don't like to play favorites, but it's one of my favorite birds on the property. This is the great lizard cuckoo, and it's an absolutely huge bird. Again, those that are familiar with Arizona, it's almost like a more arboreal version of a roadrunner, another really big cuckoo. So this bird is from like the tips of my finger past my elbow, and granted, a lot of that is tail, but they move through trees almost like squirrels. They're incredibly agile. They really only fly when they're going from tree to tree. Other than that, they're basically running through the canopy, catching and foraging on lizards. And so this is one of the species that we are tagging to be able to track around the island and understand the habitat needs on property, and then be able to try and engage with adjacent communities. Because what we know is that 1,000 acres is a decent size, but it's certainly not enough to conserve the populations of these species long into the future, which means we're going to need to build collaborative partnerships with adjacent communities and influence regional scale conservation if we're going to be able to keep incredible birds like the lizard cuckoo at Lighthouse Point. So development is wrapping up on this property in just the next couple months, and then it'll open, and then we'll be able to get into the rhythm of what our conservation work looks like in the context of the area operating as a cruise port. So I'm excited to transition over that and to get through that process of development to really be able to hone in on kind of the next steps, next stages of conservation for these species. So much more to come as we get more data, analyze, and start to take additional actions to help these species. For the final portion of our talk, I wanted to take us back much more locally here to Walt Disney World, and a focus in on a particular species, the purple martin. So the purple martin, a lot of you are probably familiar with this species, but this is a long distance migrant. But before I dive in too much more to this, a lot of what we've been talking about so far are kind of more habitat scale, larger picture, or habitat scale or community scale work at properties. I wanted to finish with the story of this particular species, the purple martin, because it's really kind of an ambassador program for that process of thinking about starting on a property. How do we benefit a particular species? How do we then engage other folks that work for Disney to be the advocates, to be the champions, to be the doers of conservation? And then how do we expand that out to engage other groups as well in the process of regional scale conservation? I talked about we're in the early stages of doing that at somewhere like Lighthouse Point in the Bahamas, but for purple martins, we've gone through those different steps, and so we're able to kind of see what the full span of trying to apply that philosophy looks like. So for those of you that may not be familiar with purple martins, super quick background on their natural history. So they're the largest species of swallow, and as like many swallows, they are aerial insectivores, and they have this long, lean body shape of swallows that gives them extreme aerodynamic maneuverability, acrobatics, aerial acrobatics. And the reason they need that is because, like most swallows, the only thing they eat are insects that they catch out of the sky. So they have to be more maneuverable than their insect prey if they're going to be able to survive. Also, like many swallows, they are a long distance migrant. So they head all the way down to the Amazon basin to spend the non-breeding grounds, or to spend the non-breeding season. And we'll talk much more about that in a little bit. I also wanted to call out that this image here shows that there's three distinct subspecies of purple martins. The one we'll focus most of our time chatting about today is the eastern subspecies of the purple martins, which extends from Canada all the way down through central US and all the way to the eastern coast. But there's also two disjunct subspecies in the western US. And the one of them is the southwestern or the desert purple martin. Now, that species is just now kind of increasing or coming to the attention of conservationists. It's just in the last couple of years that new projects led by the Tucson Audubon Society and their collaborators are starting to study in depth this species for the first time. If we have time, I can loop back to this, but they're uncovering fascinating things about differences of that species or subspecies compared to the eastern birds, to the point that it might actually be a different species of martin at this point. We're early in the early innings of doing the genetics work to see if those if they diverge at this point into two different species. Those birds will nest in purple or in saguaro cacti, giant columnar cacti. Um, the other subspecies, the northwestern or the western subspecies, is in its highest numbers in California and in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, though there's also small pockets of them all throughout the Intermountain West. Those species are a little bit more flexible in where they will nest, sometimes in birdhouses, sometimes in snags and in woodpecker holes. But the eastern subspecies, they are strange birds. I am not exaggerating when I say we don't know of any natural nesting sites for the eastern subspecies of purple martins at this point. The only place we know of them nesting is in birdhouses provided by people. Now, this practice goes back hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It started with indigenous peoples in the eastern US providing gourds for purple martins to nest in. Now, I get the question all the time, why would a bird switch from natural nesting sites to these kinds of gourds? Well, I think how it happened was these indigenous communities would use natural gourds as storage devices, as ways of transporting goods and supplies. To be able to do that, those gourds had to be dried out. So they would be hollowed out and they would be left to dry. And at that point, purple martins using woodpecker holes, and using a natural nesting site like a woodpecker hole, you're exposed to a range of different potential problems. One is parasites and diseases. You were exposed to whatever was in that woodpecker hole before the woodpecker moved out and the purple martin moved in. And there's only so many of those natural nesting holes around. And so there's a higher potential for, through the years, those parasites and disease agents to build up in those cavities. Also, predators, much easier access to a tree cavity compared to one of these gourds. And so at some point, a purple martin moved into this gourd that was being hung out to dry. And that began this process over hundreds of years of more and more indigenous people's villages intentionally putting out gourds for martins, and more martins making that switch. European colonists arrived. They started making more kind of condo apartment style purple martin houses that many of us are familiar with. And at some point in the recent past, natural nesting kind of disappeared. In fact, the last wild or natural nesting purple martin community that we're aware of was actually here in Orlando. There was an Orlando wetlands park, chock full of palm trees, many of which had died over the years. And so it left these vertical sticks coming out of the marshlands that were riddled with woodpecker holes. And 20 years ago, there was a thriving population of 100 martins at the Orlando Wetlands Park, utilizing those palm trees as nesting habitat. Since that's dwindled down, and now they only utilize that area for foraging instead of as a location for nesting. So fascinating process, but because of that, this species makes for an amazing species both to study, but as well as to leverage as an ambassador species. So we can use purple martins as a model system to study long distance migratory behavior, aerial insectivores, and what those species need from a conservation perspective. But we can also use this species because it's so tolerant of people as a way to study them and bring people along the ride to understand, get excited, and hopefully go out in their communities and be part of the solution of providing nesting habitat for this species and helping study them. So, for the remainder of this talk, we're going to shift from general purple martin natural history to we'll dive into what's going on at Walt Disney World. So, at Walt Disney World, we've got 22 of these purple martin houses, which collectively provide about 512 nesting compartments for the species. Start to arrive in January. So, but before the birds get here in December, we collect all those 512 nesting compartments. All of them get cleaned. You'll see an image of that in the upper right-hand corner. And then we add pine straw, a nesting material, a starter nesting material, to each and every one of those nesting compartments. When the birds start arriving in January, our nesting cycle is very different from your nesting cycle, and that is entirely weather driven. So you might not see purple martins until late April, early May, but our purple martins start arriving in January. Because they arrive so early, our nesting season is much, much longer and less synchronized than your nesting season is. So our birds arrive in January. They actually don't start laying eggs until late February, early March. And each pair of purple martins only raises one set of young. Um, Even though the earliest nesting birds start in late February, and the late nesting birds, they may not start their nests until the end of May. And so we have purple martins all the way into early July at Walt Disney World nesting. So as those birds are coming in, this second picture down here indicates that we have a whole group of our cast members that are on the lookout for those birds. They're looking to see if birds that have been banded in the past at Walt Disney World are coming back, to identify individuals and look for patterns of colonization, look for patterns, or not colonization, patterns of nest site selection, patterns of movement across those 22 houses, so we can better learn what these birds need to survive. Once the birds start nesting, this third picture down indicates we've got another group of cast members that twice a week we lower down each and every one of those houses so we can track how each and every one of those purple martin families are doing over the course of the season. And we do this in collaboration with the Purple Martin Conservation Association, which has been leading the longest and the most extensive single species community science project in the world, focusing on this species. So everything we do from a nest monitoring perspective, we share those data with PMCA, and we are active and ongoing partners there. Another chunk of what we do involves banding chicks. So in this bottom corner here, it's funny, the photo I used for banding chicks, that's actually an adult purple martin. Just realized that. Anyway, let's pretend it's a chick. All of our chicks at Disney's Animal Kingdom get banded. Excuse me. And we're actually in the process of starting a new study looking at native dispersal. From our banding work, we know that most of our martins are highly site faithful. If they've bred at Walt Disney World once, they're likely to come back and breed at Walt Disney World again, but not so with the chicks. We only see about 5% of our chicks coming back each year to Walt Disney World. Presumably, that's a simple inbreeding avoidance adaptation for the species. But the question then is, where do these birds go? And that's a really important question, because how far those birds travel from where they were born, that influences, or that matters, because that distance, coupled with the density of other birdhouses around Walt Disney World, that influences our ability to be able to scale up and increase populations of martins at a regional scale through time. So we just launched a new study. We've been silver banding birds on their right leg for years, but we added a green band on their legs for the first time this last year of chicks. And now the presentation, I was giving a presentation right before this one to a group of Florida purple martin landlords to try and recruit them to look for those color banded birds, so we can start to see how far our chicks are dispersing the following year when they come back to Walt Disney World to breed for the first time. Now, everything that we do, I've been focused in on kind of the martins themselves from a research perspective. But philosophically, we try and do all of this work where our guests can see, experience, and be part of it. And the rationale for that, it goes back to that philosophy I mentioned earlier, is that we want to use purple martins as an ambassador species to get folks excited about martins so that they go forth into their communities. And even if it's not martins, they try and do something at their homes and their communities to help birds and to help wildlife more broadly. And if you think about Walt Disney World, not many people are coming for the conservation experience. And so being at a place like Epcot in this picture here, going about, your vacation and stopping and seeing this funky house and seeing someone like Lauren Moscar here lowering that house and studying what's inside these gourds and getting an up close view of what's inside these gourds, that's an experience that the vast majority of these people have never had before. And it's that first, hopefully, that first deep, close connection to nature or to a bird that can inspire, a lifelong interest in pursuing a first knowledge and then action to help these species. This kind of up close connection, up close and personal intimacy with a bird, normally we discourage that kind of thing because seeing that close of an encounter with a wild bird often can lead to abandonment. But for purple martins, we've done the research to show that very little engagement, very little research, or the more extensive research and engagement we do isn't affecting the nesting success or return rates of our birds. And so we feel good that we can do this scale of work without having any kind of negative impacts on the birds. So again, it comes back to them being such a great ambassador species. Now, all of our work culminates coming up here in a couple weeks, end of April, beginning of May, with what we call Purple Martin Palooza. And at Purple Martin Palooza, we catch the adults at each and every one of those houses, and each and every one of our adults gets a health checkup. Morphometrics are taken, blood sample, fecal sample, to really try and get a full picture view of the health of those birds. I mentioned earlier that we band our adults. This is the time at which that happens. Everybody gets a silver band from the bird banding laboratory on the right leg, and on the left leg, if our birds are equipped with tracking devices like this one that you see on the left on this female purple martin, then they also get a field readable purple band. And that's what allows us to identify individuals without recapturing them in future years when those birds go back to South America and then return to Walt Disney World in subsequent years. Any birds that we catch that are banded, we can read that silver band on the right hand leg. That's a 9-digit number, but it's virtually impossible to identify that bird to an individual number without catching it again. That's why we use those purple bands on the left leg. So I'm going to pivot now and talk a little bit more about the kinds of things that we've been learning through the research that we do. And I have to say, I'll call out individual collaborators along the way, but there's an extensive international Purple Martin working group of researchers from Canada all the way down to South America that work together to better understand this species and drive their conservation. So this work is certainly not representative of work just done by Disney. It takes a village to learn about and conserve purple martins. So this first study, the data was collected at Walt Disney World, but it's connected to what happens all the way on the breeding grounds in Brazil. So part of that health study that I mentioned is we take a single feather sample and then we analyze those feathers. It's the Northern Arizona University, our collaborators, that do that analysis. And we're looking at the chemical signatures in that feather, because a feather acts as a little mini time capsule of what a bird experienced physiologically at the time the feather was grown. Purple martins change out all their feathers on the non-breeding grounds in Brazil. And so we were interested to see if things that the birds were exposed to on the non-breeding grounds could be impacting the birds all the way onto the breeding grounds. So we know that the Amazon, where purple martins spend the winter, or rather the non-breeding season, we know that there's high levels of mercury in the water there. Some areas there's naturally high levels of mercury, but in a lot of areas there's increased contamination due to illegal gold mining. And that illegal gold mining, the primary contaminant resulting from the processing of the ore to get the gold, is mercury. Not only that, but there's extensive amounts of hydroelectric dams all throughout the Amazon. And the process of slowing water movement actually allows, in water bodies, it increases the rate that mercury is converted into a form that will bioaccumulate more regularly. So the connection in with martins in particular, most of what martins eat starts out its larval phase in the water. And so these larvae are living in this mercury soup. They emerge as adults flying, and then purple martins forage on them. And so what we observed in feathers that had higher mercury contamination, that's what you see on the x-axis there. The higher the mercury contamination, the lighter the bird. But these weren't structurally smaller birds. These were birds that were similar size that were lighter because they had fewer fat reserves. Now, the reason that matters so much is as those birds are migrating from Brazil all the way back to Walt Disney World, the primary fuel they're burning is fat, and mercury is stored in fat. And so, as they're migrating, their concentrations of mercury are increasing in their body, and they're physiologically more stressed at the time when they are physiologically working the hardest. And so this is a pattern observed 6 months delayed from when the exposure to mercury happened and the feather was grown, and what the weight of these birds was at the time that they were breeding. And this is just the birds that survived. So it's entirely possible that these contaminants are having a massive impact on long distance migrants, on aerial insectivores that we just quite simply didn't know about until now. Again, coming back to that idea of using purple martins as a model to understand the threats and what we can do to help larger groups of birds. So this is the first of hopefully a much bigger study looking at an array of different chemicals and what their impacts could be on martins and other species that spend the season down in Brazil, or spend the non-breeding season down in Brazil. I want to shift now to going beyond Walt Disney World and talking about what we've learned from our tracking devices. So this is an example of one of those GPS tracking devices. These have come a long way in a very short period of time to now being solar powered, and so they can gather points every 4 hours throughout the entire day, 365. And so we're getting for the first time this picture of the full and complete life cycle of purple martins 1 year at a time. What you're looking at on the right is the data that we got back from 10 birds from 2013. Every color is a different bird. And this is revealing the intricacies of their migration that before the previous versions of devices that we've deployed only gave us snapshots. So our birds, they migrate down through Cuba, head to Central America, track along Central America down into the Amazon. We do this tracking work in collaboration with lots of other partners. And lots of eastern purple martins are going all throughout the Amazon, but Florida birds, for whatever reason, still just trying to figure this out. Almost all of their time is spent right along the Amazon River. You can see that band of color that corresponds to the Amazon River itself. And then on their northern journey, they don't follow exactly the same pathway. When they get to Colombia, they actually go over a big stretch of ocean to cut out a big distance of that migratory journey to get to Nicaragua and Honduras more quickly. And then they go up to the Yucatan and they do it again. Instead of going through Cuba, they straight shot all the way from the Yucatan into Florida to the breeding grounds. And those kinds of information is critical to better understand the migratory pathways and the conservation needs of this species. But we don't just learn about pathways, we also get a much deeper dive on the habitat needs and habitat utilization of these species. On the left is a land use map around Walt Disney World. Pink is developed, green is natural, blue is open bodies of water. Black is areas where breeding colonies of purple martins are. And then what we've seen is that purple martins, despite the fact that they nest in association with people, they actually preferentially forage over natural wetlands. They still depend on on healthy aquatic ecosystems to support their foraging. And that is true in the Amazon as well. So those squares, instead of being breeding locations, those are roosting locations where purple martins gather together in huge numbers, and they preferentially pick little habitat islands in the middle of these vast river complexes. And they preferentially pick what are called black water rivers that are high in tannins. And a result of that, they are lower in aquatic arthropod communities, which means going up the food chain, there are fewer predators. But they forage over whitewater rivers, which are heavy with sediment, which supports highly biodiverse, highly abundant arthropod communities, which translates into much, much higher densities of insects over the top of those white water areas. Pretty clever birds. So to wrap things up here, I wanted to bring things back a little bit closer to home, but still connected to that roost idea. One aspect of purple martin biology is once they're done breeding, they form a massive roost that's called a pre-migratory roost. And we're just at the front end of really understanding the ins and outs of what makes pre-migratory roosts tick and how they function. Oftentimes we're able to find pre-migratory roosts because there's so many birds that leave first thing in the morning that they're picked up on weather radar. And that's what you're looking at right now. This is an early July morning on the west coast of Florida, where purple martins roost in small mangrove islands off the coast. They're always between Cedar Keys here and Crystal River here. And this span, the roost moves year to year through this span of protected mangroves. There's some wildlife refuges here. There's state protected lands. But fortunately, this area is safe for martins. But because they move that roost every year, we've actually never been able to find and study this roost. We got a little bit of better idea based on this GPS data. We learned a little bit more about the intricacies of how these roosts function. While there's still one mega roost, that's what that weather radar is picking up, there's still a lot of individual movement. You'll notice that there's not just one central point and one color blast coming out of one roost. There's movement between multiple, but then you still see there's a couple areas where that's really concentrated. And so between our weather radar roost and our GPS data, we were able to partner with a National Geographic photographer and explorer to try and find that roost for the very first time. And so last year, for the first time, somebody got eyes on this roost. And Carlton Ward photographed both birds coming in right at dusk, as well as birds emerging out of that roost first thing in the morning. And we don't have a good way of counting this many birds yet, but his back of the envelope calculation was over 100,000 purple martins were all utilizing this one single mangrove island. I don't know if you can see on the right, but the sky is absolutely just filled with small dots of martins as they circle over this island in preparation to land for the night. There's so much left to learn about this species. Every time we learn another piece of the purple martin puzzle, we find out there's more to be inspired by, there's more to learn, and there's more that we need to do to keep this incredible species thriving, flying all the way to North America, all the way down to Brazil, and back each year. I want to close out this talk with a huge thank you to you, because purple martins and all of our bird life here in North America is dependent on people to help them survive. People are the cause of so many of the problems that our biodiversity faces, but that means that people are also the solutions. And I know that you are active, not just in enjoying the birds around where you are, but also in conserving them. So thank you for the work that you do to keep our bird populations thriving. And thank you again for having me to chat with you tonight.
Thank you. Excellent. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Yeah, this is Elois. Do they mate for life? What do you know about their mating habits?
Oh, so they're the polar opposite of the Siberian crane. So they mate for life, but for purple martins, it's the exact opposite. Every year, it's like The Bachelor, every single year at Walt Disney World. Because the funny thing is they're a site faithful bird. 50% of the time, they come back to the exact same house. 75% of the time, our houses are clustered, so they're coming back to the same cluster of houses. So it's not like they don't recognize the bird that they mated with the previous year, but they almost never re-nest with the same bird 2 years running. And by almost, I mean we've got about 600 birds that breed at Walt Disney World each year, and in all of those like there's one every couple years that's renesting with the same bird. Like to the point that they're actually, it seems like they're avoiding renesting with the same bird.
How many eggs per nest?
So purple martins will lay anywhere in the range from 1 to 7, but 5 is the magic number, and 4 and 6 are the next most common.
And that's probably just from the mating of one male and one female, right? Not two males.
That is an excellent question. So I mentioned The Bachelor before. Now we need to dive in deeper. That there might be some shenanigans happening here. We know people that have studied extra pair paternity farther north have definitely seen it in purple martins. And we're at the front end, all those blood samples that I talked about, we collect those from chicks as well as from adults. And so we're collaborating with the Field Museum. They're actually in the process of analyzing several years worth of blood samples to build out paternity and maternity maps to see, all right, we know what the social mate situation looks on, but is that actually represented in the biological maternity and paternity of these nests as well?
Right, because someone back in Minnesota where I used to live, this was years ago, 20 years ago, he suspected as much. He had tons of martins and he watched them pretty closely.
I think I think the question is how extensive it is. I would be shocked if there was none. It's actually more common among birds than we think it is, or that we used to think it is. Now the world of genetics has kind of popped this box wide open. So it's more a matter of is it an occasional thing or is it running rampant through the colony?
Yeah. Interesting.
I have a question, Jason. So do you see any patterns about mating of the purple martins within the community there? I mean, is it do you see that this female who used to be in this house is now at the Animal Kingdom, is now at the, I don't know, at Epcot, or are there any, do you have any ideas of who's switching off with whom?
That's a great question. We need to run the analysis to learn more about what might cause individuals to move. At this point, the analyses we've run have been more about understanding what's happening at a population scale. So that's where I get numbers like 50% of the time, same house, 75% of the time, same group of houses. But I would love to kind of flip from the population level analysis to the individual level analysis. For those birds that do move, are there patterns that are emerging behind why those movements are going on? Oftentimes in birds, if somebody experiences a nest failure, and we have really high nest success, but not all of them succeed every year. Is that what motivates switching to a different location? So we've got the data. It's just a matter of now finding the time and digging down and answering some of those questions. But I love that one. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Do the Pacific Northwest and the Arizona populations, do they also winter in the Amazon basin, or is their wintering grounds different?
That is a fascinating question. Hang on one second. So I trimmed this presentation down quite a bit. Let me share my screen again. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so one of the big outcomes that's come from this International Purple Martin Working Group is a whole set of studies that are based now in South America that complement all the work happening in North America. And so the name of that work is under the umbrella Proyecto Andorinha Azul, which is Purple Martin Project in Portuguese. We didn't get super creative on this one. But based on our tracking work, purple martins from the eastern US are all in the Amazon basin and in the agricultural areas south of the Amazon basin here that I'm circling. But the part of this study in South America was leveraging the birders of Brazil to identify the full distribution of where purple martins go in the country in the non-breeding season. And it turns out that there's this whole swath of other purple martins all along the eastern coastline. To the best of our knowledge, those aren't eastern purple martins. We have exactly one data point from a desert purple martin, and that bird was tracked to right here in this big gap where there's absolutely no data. Because part of the problem is Brazil is a vast country and vast portions of it are undeveloped. And so these data that you're looking at are skewed toward areas where bird watchers are going. So one data point for southwestern or for desert martins, and then we have a few data points from this region for birds from the northwest coming over and wintering over here. So presumably all of these birds are those other two subspecies.
Getting back to the beginning of your presentation with Walt Disney and the different movies and documentaries that you showed that highlight connections with the natural world, it made me think about the creativity involved with my favorite Disney animated film of all time, which is Robin Hood. And the kind of creative mood to make what we typically know in that Robin Hood story as human characters as animals. And just kind of blur the lines and play with that a little bit of they are us, we are them kind of aspect. Oh, Robin Hood, Little John are a fox and a bear, and so it makes me think of just that continues to be the legacy that yourself and all the cast members there are doing, is creating those connections, trying to make us connect to the creaturely world in such a way where we see ourselves in them and them as us. And thank you for being part of that work and for sharing that work with us tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. It was a true pleasure to join you. Thank you.
Indeed. Well, everybody, we've come to the end of our time. Just one further announcement that I neglected, which is in May, will be our annual meeting as well. And so we're still working on the details of where the location will be. We might have a bird walk at the Bagley Nature Area as part of that. And it might also be the third Thursday instead of the second Tuesday of the month. So still working out some details. So keep an eye out for an email at the end of April, early May regarding that. I think that's it, everybody. Feel free to go home, go to bed, whatever you need to do.
Jason, most enjoyable talk. Thank you very much. And thank you for your work. It was very good.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Jason.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vicky. I appreciate you setting this up.
I appreciate you doing it. Thank you. It was nice seeing
Absolutely.
you too.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. We'll have to catch up sometime soon.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Jason. And yeah, good to have you.
Have a great night, all.
Yeah.
Good night.